Receive this knowledge and rule with wisdom.
I pledge my reverence and accept.
The oldest written document of kingship ever discovered tells us that the first ruler of humanity reigned for 28,800 years. Not 28 years. Not 280 years. 28,800 years. Modern scholars call this mythology, a symbolic number, religious poetry inscribed on clay, but the Sumerians who wrote it weren't poets, they were accountants. Obsessive record keepers who tracked grain stores down to the bushel, land plots down to the square meter, and business contracts with witnesses and dates. These were the people who invented writing itself specifically to keep accurate records. And yet, when they turned to their own history, they wrote this. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. This isn't found on one damaged tablet. Multiple copies exist. The numbers are consistent. The scribes weren't guessing. They were copying from older sources, preserving something they believed to be true. So we're left with a question that cuts to the foundation of everything we think we know about human history. Were the Sumerians, the civilization that gave us mathematics, astronomy, and the written word, simply making up absurd numbers when they documented their own origins? Or were they recording something real, something so far outside our current understanding of history that we've chosen to file it away as myth rather than confront what it might actually mean? The Sumerian King List exists. You can see it. The most complete version, the Weld-Blundell prism, sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, a clay prism covered in cuneiform script listing the kings of Sumer, their cities, and the lengths of their reigns. What makes this document extraordinary isn't just its age. It's that the ancient scribes made no distinction between what we would call mythological kings and historical ones. There's no chapter break, no change in tone, no disclaimer. The list flows seamlessly from rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years to kings. We can verify through archaeology, as if it's all one continuous record. The document opens with a declaration. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Kingship didn't emerge. It didn't evolve. It descended from heaven to one specific place, Eridu. And the first king was Alulim. His reign, 28,800 years. The second king, Alalga, ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings total ruled before the Great Flood from 5 different cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. These aren't round numbers that suggest exaggeration. They're precise. They're multiples of 60, the base of the Sumerian mathematical system. Scholars point to this as evidence of symbolic meaning, numerological significance rather than literal time. But symbolic of what? If you wanted to record a truth that transcended normal human experience, rulers who were something other than human, or a span of time measured differently than mortal years, how would you do it? You'd use the numbers that held cosmological meaning in your culture. You'd encode the information in the language of the divine. The Sumerian King List doesn't read like legend. It reads like a chronicle. It lists cities we've excavated. It names dynasties that left behind artifacts. And it places these historical, verifiable rulers in direct continuity with kings who ruled for millennia. The text offers no explanation for the extraordinary reign lengths. It simply states them, the same way it states that Eridu was the first city, that kingship came from heaven, and that after the flood, everything changed. For the Sumerians, this wasn't their mythology. This was their history. Eridu wasn't legendary. It was real. The site, now called Tel Abu Shahrain, sits in the desert of southern Iraq, and what archaeologists found there confirms what the ancient texts claimed. This place was sacred long before history began. Excavations uncovered 18 temple structures built directly on top of each other, each new generation constructing their house of worship on the ruins of the last. The deepest layer, Temple 18, dates to roughly 5,400 BCE, one of the oldest religious structures ever found. 18 temples, thousands of years of continuous worship at the exact location the Sumerians themselves identified as the beginning of everything. This wasn't a city that grew important over time. It started important. The texts tell us why. Eridu was the home of Enki, called Ea in later Akkadian, one of the most powerful of the Anunnaki gods. Not a war god, not a sky god, the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of creation itself. His temple was called Abzu, the house of the Abzu. The Abzu, according to Sumerian belief, was a vast body of fresh water that existed beneath the earth, the source of all springs, rivers, and wells. It was Enki's domain, the realm of hidden knowledge and primordial power. And Eridu was built directly over it, at the edge of the marshlands where fresh water met land, where the boundary between the world above and the world below grew thin. If the Anunnaki were going to establish a foothold on Earth, if they were going to plant the first seed of human civilization, this was the place they chose. Not by accident, by design. The Eridu Genesis tablet states it plainly. Eridu was the first of 5 cities founded before the flood, a direct act of the gods. The city belonged to Enki. He gave it his protection. He gave it his knowledge. And the kingship that descended from heaven began here. The archaeological record matches the claim. The earliest layers at Eridu show a level of organization and intentionality that doesn't fit the narrative of slow, organic development. This wasn't a settlement that gradually became important. It was built to be a center from the start, and it remained one for millennia. 18 temples stacked on top of each other, each one honoring the same god. Each one preserving the memory that this place was the beginning. When the Sumerian scribes wrote that Alulim ruled from Eridu for 800 years, they weren't writing about a random village or a symbolic location. They were writing about the place their entire civilization recognized as the origin point. The city of the god of wisdom, built on the edge of the abyss, where something that was not human once walked among men and taught them to become something more. The Sumerian King List names 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Between them, they accumulated 241,200 years of reign across 5 cities, beginning with Alulim of Eridu. But the question that cuts through every attempt at rational explanation is this: what were they? The texts don't call them ordinary men. The opening line of the King List makes that clear. Kingship descended from heaven. These weren't elected leaders or conquering warlords. They were installed. By whom? The same beings who founded the cities themselves. The Anunnaki. And these kings didn't rule alone. Mesopotamian tradition preserves another layer to this story, one that makes the impossible reign lengths even stranger. The Apkallu. 7 primordial sages sent by Enki before the flood to bring the arts of civilization to humanity. These weren't men. The texts describe them as semi-aquatic, part fish, or wearing the skin of fish. Beings who emerged from the waters of the Abzu to teach humanity writing, mathematics, law, architecture, agriculture. Everything that separates civilization from chaos, they brought. And the earliest kings had them as advisors. Alulim, the first king, was guided by an Apkallu named Adapa. The traditions are explicit about this. The king ruled, but the knowledge came from something older, something that didn't belong to the human world. So who was Alulim? A man who lived for 28,000 800 years? A title passed down through a dynasty that lasted millennia? Or was he one of the Anunnaki themselves, ruling directly over the new creation, with other Anunnaki serving as the sages who encoded the blueprint of civilization into human culture? Scholars dismiss the reign lengths as symbolic. They point to the sexagesimal system, the Sumerian base, 60 mathematics, and note that the numbers are multiples of 3,600 Asar and 600 Anir. This suggests cosmological meaning, not literal chronology. But what if the Sumerians were describing something real using the only framework they had? What if these beings experienced time differently? Or what if the scribes were trying to convey that the era itself was beyond normal measurement, that the age of the Apkallu and the god-kings operated under different rules than the world that came after? The King List records the reigns as fact. The Eridu Genesis describes the gods walking among men. The Apkallu traditions describe inhuman teachers bringing forbidden knowledge from beneath the waters. Either the Sumerians invented an elaborate, internally consistent mythology and then recorded it with the same precision they used for tax records and grain shipments, or they were documenting the memory of an age when humanity's rulers were not entirely human, when beings from beyond this world governed the first cities and shaped the species they had created to serve them. And then the flood came, and that world ended. The Eridu Genesis tablet is broken. Not metaphorically, physically. Large sections are missing, the clay fractured and lost to time. But what remains tells the oldest version of the flood story ever written, older than the Epic of Gilgamesh, older than the biblical account, older than any other creation myth we possess. And it begins with a purpose. Humanity was created by the goddess Nintu to bear the toil of the gods. We weren't made for our own sake. We were made to work, to serve, to free the Anunnaki from the labor of maintaining the world they had built. The tablet describes the establishment of the first cities. Eridu was given to Enki, Badtibira to Dumuzi, Larak to Pabilsag, Sipar to Utu, Shurupak to Sud. 5 cities, 5 divine rulers, the blueprint of civilization laid out by the Anunnaki themselves. For a time, perhaps thousands of years, perhaps the 241,200 years recorded in the King List, this arrangement held. But then, something changed. The tablet breaks here, the text fragmentary, but when it resumes, the god Enlil is speaking to the divine council. Humanity has become a problem. The reason given is their noise, a word that has puzzled translators for decades. Was it literal noise? Overpopulation, the clamor of too many voices disturbing the gods' rest? Or was it something else? Rebellion, the acquisition of knowledge meant to remain divine, humanity growing beyond the role assigned to them. The text doesn't clarify. It only records the decision. The human species would be destroyed. A flood would sweep over the earth and return it to silence. The council of the Anunnaki agreed. All of them, except one, Enki, the god of Eridu, the god of wisdom. The one who had walked among humans from the beginning, whose city held the first temple, whose Apkallu had taught humanity everything they knew. He refused. The tablet describes Enki's betrayal in fragments. He approached a king named Ziusudra, a ruler of Shurupak, the last of the antediluvian cities, and he warned him, not openly. The text says Enki spoke to the wall of Ziusudra's house, knowing the king stood on the other side, listening. "Tear down your house," Enki whispered through the reed wall. "Build a boat." The god gave precise instructions, dimensions, materials. A vessel large enough to hold animals, seed, and the knowledge that must not be lost. Ziusudra obeyed. And when the flood came, when Enlil released the waters to drown the noise of humanity, when the other Anunnaki watched the world they had built disappear beneath the rising tide, Ziusudra survived. The Eridu Genesis breaks again here. The next legible section shows the gods in the aftermath and Enlil's fury when he discovers a human lived. But Enki defended his choice. Humanity, he argued, should not be completely erased. They had value. They deserved to continue. The council eventually accepted this, but the world of the antediluvian kings was gone. What's preserved in this broken tablet isn't just an ancient flood story, it's a record of a fracture within the Anunnaki themselves. A split between those who saw humanity as disposable and the one who saw them as worth saving. Enki's act of rebellion didn't just preserve the human species, it ended the age of direct divine rule. After the flood, the gods would no longer walk openly among men. The Apkallu would not return. The 28,800-year reigns would become impossible. The question the tablet raises, the one that sits in its fragmented, unfinished lines, is this: what was the noise that angered Enlil so deeply? What had humanity done, or learned, or become that made the gods regret their creation? And what knowledge did Enki make sure survived the water? The Sumerian King List records the end of the first world in 5 words. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no description, just a plain statement of fact, separating everything that came before from everything that came after. Before the flood, 8 kings across 5 cities, ruling for a combined 241,200 years. After the flood, kingship once again descended from heaven, but not to Eridu, to Kish. The first post-flood king was Jushur. His reign length, 1,200 years, not 28,800, not 36,000, 1,200. Still impossible by our standards, still superhuman, but compared to what came before, it represents a catastrophic decline, a reduction of more than 95% from the era of Alulim. And the reigns kept shrinking. The kings who followed Jushur ruled for centuries, then decades, then finally lifespans we would recognize as within the boundaries of human possibility. By the time the list reaches the historical kings we can verify through archaeology, the reign lengths match what we expect. The pattern is undeniable. Something fundamental changed after the flood. The nature of kingship itself transformed. Were the new rulers fully human, no longer the god kings or Anunnaki hybrids who governed Eridu? Did the direct bloodline connecting heaven and earth get severed beneath the waters? Or did the method of measuring time itself change, the scribes now recording mortal years instead of the cosmic spans that governed the antediluvian age? The King List doesn't answer, it only shows the dividing line. The city of Eridu appears again in later sections, but never as it was. Never as the first city, the seat of the oldest kingship, the place where it all began. That era was gone. The temples would continue to be rebuilt on the same sacred ground for thousands of years, but the world they honored, the world of Enki and the Apkallu, of kings who ruled for millennia, was buried. What was lost when the waters rose? The Eridu Genesis preserves Enki's warning to Ziusudra: build a boat, save the animals, protect the seed, but it says nothing about what couldn't be saved. The tablet doesn't describe what sank beneath the flood, what knowledge remained in the submerged ruins of the first cities, what technologies or wisdom the Apkallu had brought from the Abzu that humanity would have to rediscover or never recover at all. The libraries, Eridu. The records of the 28,800-year reign. The methods by which the antediluvian kings governed, the sciences they knew, the relationship they maintained with the Anunnaki who installed them. All of it drowned. Ziusudra survived, and through him, humanity continued. But the King List makes it clear, what emerged after the flood was a diminished version of what existed before. Shorter reigns, smaller scope, a world where the gods no longer descended to walk openly among their creation. The post-flood section of the King List reads like a slow return to normalcy, or a slow descent into amnesia. Each generation further removed from the age when rulers were more than human, when cities were founded by divine decree, when sages emerged from the waters to teach civilization itself. By the time Sumerian culture reached its classical period, the era of Gilgamesh, of Ur, of the temples and ziggurats we associate with ancient Mesopotamia, Eridu had become a memory, a sacred site, the place of the first temple. But the world it represented was myth. Except the King List never calls it myth. It simply records. Eridu was first. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Then the flood swept over. What the Sumerians preserved in their carefully copied tablets wasn't a creation story designed to explain the unknown. It was a record of a world that actually ended. A dividing line in history so absolute that everything before it became incomprehensible to those who came after. We excavate the ruins and find 18 temples stacked on top of each other. We translate the King List and see impossible numbers. We read the Eridu Genesis and find a god betraying his own kind to save a species he helped create. And we're left with the same question the scribes must have asked as they copied these texts from sources even older than themselves. Who were we before the flood? What did we lose beneath the water? And why does the oldest history ever written begin not with the rise of humanity, but with the end of something that came before? The Sumerian King List isn't a collection of myths. It's a boundary marker, a record of where one world ended and another began, preserved by scribes who refused to let the memory disappear completely. Eridu was real. The temples existed, the texts survive, and the numbers, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 241,200 years total, were copied and recopied across centuries by a civilization that invented writing specifically to record truth. What they're telling us is that human history didn't begin where we think it did. It began after a catastrophic reset in the shadow of something older. Subscribe if you want to keep digging into the tablets mainstream archaeology has filed away as legend. Because the story of who we are may only make sense once we understand who we were before the flood swept over.